Welcome to our first lecture of week 8 for the spring semester of 2021. We have more or less finished World War I, and we are going to transition into the 20s, but we'll begin today with a look at the peace process that ended World War I, in particular the Treaty of Versailles. We'll also discuss racial unrest and outbreaks of racial violence in the U.S. at the end of the 1910s and the early part of the 1920s, and some of the reasons that resulted in that racial violence. We will discuss culture of consumption in our second lecture of this week, which will be on Thursday, March 11th. Before I go any further, I know I sent an email on Monday with a note on the first primary source analysis assignments, which have all been graded at this point. For the most part, I thought you guys did pretty well as a class for your first assignment, especially in conditions like we're undergoing right now, where we haven't met in person, and it's difficult to really, for me to really get a gauge on how much you guys are, how much of what I'm discussing in these lectures are resonating with you. I think you guys, for the most part, did a good job. As I mentioned in the email, if you're disappointed or unhappy with your grade, don't sweat it too much. Don't worry too much. There's still another primary source analysis assignment, as well as 2 other exams between now and the final. So there's ample opportunity for you to improve your grade and come out of here with a very solid grade in the class that you can be satisfied with. One additional note on the exams that you've already done, that you submitted last week. I'm just now beginning to get to those exams as far as grading. My hope, my goal is to have them all graded by the end of this weekend or by the beginning of next week. So hopefully by Monday of next week, they will all be graded. And at that point, you'll know your grades on the exams, as well as the primary source analysis assignment number 1, which you've already completed. So with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, let's move on and take a look at the end of World War I as far as the peace negotiation process. So World War I comes to an end on the battlefield in early November of 1918. It is November 11th, 1918 is Armistice Day, which brings an end to the fighting of World War I. That's why, part of the reason why Veterans Day today is celebrated in America on November 11th. It commemorates World War I and America's involvement in World War I, the sort of the first Armistice Day to end a global war in which America was involved. Although that was when the war ended on the battlefield, the peace negotiation process took place after that, and even in the early months of 1918, before Armistice Day on November 11th, President Woodrow Wilson was preparing for the peace process. In fact, he publicly outlined his peace objectives to a joint session of the U.S. Congress in January of 1918. He came up with what was known as the 14 points, a list of 14 specific policies that he wanted enacted in order to come to agreement on peace and officially put the war behind not only the U.S., but the powers of Europe on both sides, the Allied powers, which America was partnered with, notably Great Britain and France, as well as the Central Powers, including Germany and Austria-Hungary. Some of these were pretty standard concessions that Wilson hoped the Central Powers were willing to make. Free travel of the seas for both visitors and for trade purposes. We talked about the sinking of the Lusitania and some of the other German submarine attacks in the seas during the war. Obviously, Wilson and his counterparts in Great Britain and France wanted to see freedom of movement, if you will, in the seas without having to worry about an attack from Germany on either passenger ships or military ships. A reduction of arms and a return to diplomacy rather than, military force to resolve differences. So those were some of the key points that Wilson included in his peace proposal, but not all of the allies or the Central Powers agreed with what Wilson proposed, and we'll get to that right now. The actual negotiations for peace lasted a long time, 6 months. Really, the first half of the year of 1919, Wilson spent the bulk of that time in France with his counterparts from Great Britain, Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and France, their head of state, Georges Clemenceau, and they were coming up with proposals for peace. In particular, Great Britain and France really wanted to penalize Germany because they believed that Germany was the primary villain, if you will, in the war. That Germany had the central role in causing the war. Remember, the war was quite destructive across Western Europe. There was quite a bit of death, not only within the military of these respective countries, but a lot of civilians died as well. Land was torn up and destroyed. There was a whole lot of death and destruction that came with World War I. That's part of the reason why it was referred to by many during the time period as the Great War, and it is said that an entire generation of European men were lost to the Great War. So, as you might expect, Great Britain and France, which were involved in the war from the very beginning in 1914 and lost many more lives in terms of their military personnel than the U.S., which didn't enter the war until the spring and summer of 1917. They really wanted Germany to pay for their role in the war. Specifically, they wanted Germany to pay reparations and to admit guilt for the war. These were conditions that Germany did not particularly want to concede, but ultimately they did concede, but it left a very bitter feeling amongst many Germans, both in the military and in the government, and in the rank and file citizenry of the German population. You could almost make the argument that it sowed the seeds of resentment that ultimately led to Adolf Hitler coming to power and Germany causing World War II a generation later. That the harsh terms that Germany had to face and agree to at the end of World War I is listed as a primary reason for the outbreak of World War II. We will get to World War II in detail later this semester. But getting back to the treaty itself, besides paying reparations and admitting guilt for the war, Germany had to give up specific territories, including Alsace-Lorraine, which had been French territory. Germany occupied it during the war. They had to return it to France after the war. And they also had Germany had a number of small colonies that they occupied in Africa and in the islands in the Pacific that they had to give up as terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson, one of his major goals with this treaty was he wanted self-determination, in which former territories and former occupied lands could form their own governments and self-govern, basically. And that was soundly rejected for a number of reasons. But Wilson's goal of self-determination was never realized in the war, and as we go forward, we will see that is another indirect cause of World War II, because you had citizens in former territories in the Ottoman Empire that some were part of were added to other countries, some became independent countries, and relations were, shall we say, tense amongst many folks in that part of Eastern Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. Perhaps Wilson's grandest vision, his greatest idea with the 14 points in which he wanted to get accomplished with the Treaty of Versailles, was the League of Nations. You can think of the League of Nations as sort of a precursor to the United Nations, which we have today, the UN, but it would be an organized body that had government representatives from nations across the U.S., or including the U.S., as well as throughout Europe and other areas of the world, and the idea being that it would try to promote diplomacy and open discussion whenever there might be conflict or tension between nations, so that another world war wouldn't break out. That was the goal, to be solving problems through diplomacy rather than war. The League of Nations was agreed to by the representatives at the Treaty of Versailles, Lloyd George and Clemenceau, as well as Wilson. But when Wilson returned home to the United States, he faced stiff opposition for the League of Nations from Congress. In particular, Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican U.S. Senator, opposed the League of Nations. He just thought that it allowed the U.S. to be forced into oversight by an independent body, and he thought that would limit American foreign policy. America was a sovereign nation, as Lodge saw it, and that they should be able to make their own decisions with regard to foreign policy and not have to get it approved by some organized body with representatives from all these other countries. Lodge was able to convince enough of his fellow senators, particularly on the Republican side, but even some Democrats as well, to oppose Wilson and Wilson's proposal. Wilson, in an attempt to counter Lodge's attacks, traveled across the country trying to speak directly to the American people and persuade them to support it and put pressure on their senators and their representatives. He traveled 8,000 miles and delivered 32 speeches in just over 3 weeks. Shortly after he returned from that gauntlet of political persuasion, if you will, trying to rally American citizens behind his policy proposal, Wilson suffered a stroke that had long-term physical ramifications for him. He was an invalid for the rest of his life, and the final year and a half of his presidency, he was very limited physically with what he could do. That happened after he went on this big public speaking gauntlet. The end result was that Wilson was unable to convince the American public to put enough pressure on their senators to thwart Henry Cabot Lodge's attempt at defeating the League of Nations. The League of Nations was ultimately established, and 58 countries joined the League of Nations, but because of the opposition from Henry Cabot Lodge, that portion of the Treaty of Versailles was not signed, not ratified by the U.S., and so America never joined the League of Nations. That weakened the League of Nations as a whole, as America was, at this point, developing into a significant military superpower and also a leading economic nation as well. And, they were gaining in influence around the world, but because of the opposition from Lodge and the Republican Party, America couldn't join the League of Nations. And some historians argue that had America joined the League of Nations, perhaps they could have intervened to prevent World War II or to prevent the escalation of the war in the early years, in the late 1930s. So the League of Nations was established. America declines to join. It's not nearly as influential as it would have been had America joined. And we'll see after World War II, the League of Nations 2.0, if you will, is formed in what we now know as the United Nations. And of course, that still exists today. And America is very much a significant part of the League of Nations today, with sending an ambassador to the UN to represent the American government. And that ambassador post to the League of Nations is considered a cabinet level position within the U.S. Presidential administration today. So now that we've discussed the Treaty of Versailles and its impact, let's take a look at what was happening in America in 1919 and the early 1920s. And I want to focus in particular on widespread racial violence and racial unrest that began in 1919 and continued into the 1920s, in the early part of the 1920s. So we'll start with 1919. In the spring and summer months of that year, a series of race riots broke out across America. It became known as Red Summer throughout the nation. The first racial riot occurred in April, and subsequent riots unfolded in the ensuing months all the way until October. The most prominent of the riots that took place in 1919 occurred in late July in Chicago. hot summer day. Plenty of folks were at a man-made beach on the shores of Lake Michigan. At this time, in segregated Jim Crow America, there was a whites-only section of this beach and a blacks-only section of the beach. And what happened was a black child, a teenager, had a raft and was in the lake, and the raft drifted over the invisible border into the white section of the beach, or the white section of the lake. So the white beachgoers attempted to stone the black teen, whose name was Eugene Williams. He wound up sliding off of his raft, and he drowned once he essentially slipped off the raft into the water. Police arrived on the scene. They refused to make any arrests related to the incident, and as a result, a black beachgoer then fired a shot into a group of police officers, who promptly responded by opening fire and shooting the black beachgoer to death. That was the cause of what turned out to be a deadly and destructive week throughout Chicago. A week's worth of violence unfolded between black and white Chicagoans. By the end of that week, the riots had resulted in the deaths of 38 people, and more than 500 people were injured, and there was a tremendous amount of property that was destroyed throughout Chicago, particularly in the African American residential and business communities in Chicago during that summer of 1919. Outside of Chicago, there were other race riots that occurred across the country, including in cities such as Washington, D.C., Houston, Charleston, South Carolina, and Elaine, Arkansas. By the time the summer ended and the final riots ended in early October, 25 total race riots had occurred in the U.S. For the year 1919, and 80 lynchings, which were racially motivated, had also occurred. So a lot of violence, a lot of death, mostly African Americans dying at the hands of whites, but there were some white casualties as well, and just a very, very violent time, and especially a very scary time if you were an African American, a black American living in the United States in 1919. That covers 1919, but 2 years later, in 1921, there was another act of incredible racial violence in the city of Tulsa. It is known today as the Tulsa Race Massacre. It occurred in June of 1921. Police officers in Tulsa and white vigilantes destroyed Greenwood, which was the city's African-American business district. It was an upscale section of Tulsa, described by some observers, including Booker T. Washington, as Black Wall Street. Washington actually referred to it as Negro Wall Street, due to the neighborhood's large concentration of black-owned businesses and the large, expensive homes in the neighborhood where the city's prosperous black citizens resided. Hundreds of black Tulsans died in the Tulsa Race Massacre, and businesses were looted and burned to the ground, basically destroying Black Wall Street and the Greenwood area in Tulsa. If you look at the image in the upper right-hand corner of the slide here, you can see the aftermath of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. You can see that whatever storefronts and businesses had been in that particular part of Greenwood had nothing but rubble on the ground as an observer looks on. Just a tremendously dispiriting and deflating experience for Black Tulsans, and yet another example of this racial violence that occurred in 1919 across the U.S. So that begs the question, you might be wondering, what caused all of this racial violence to erupt during this time period? I mean, America's coming back from a war. You know, the U.S. has become a military superpower. There was economic growth. Why would there be such an environment of racial unrest during this time? Well, there were a number of factors, and when I get through explaining them, I think you'll have a good idea as to why tensions boiled over during this time period between white and Black Americans. First and foremost, as we discussed, World War I had concluded, and that meant the return of military veterans from the war, white veterans as well as Black veterans. And we talked in the most recent lecture from last week about the Black men who served in World War I. Many of them had been on labor detail, but some of them had seen combat, such as the Harlem Hellfighters that we talked about last week. Prominent civil rights activists of the time, including W.E.B. Du Bois, encouraged Black men to enlist and serve in the military during the war under the idea that patriotism, if they displayed their patriotism to their country, that they would be accepted by their white brethren in the U.S. Their fellow white Americans would realize that Black men and Black communities were just as invested in helping the U.S. war effort as they were. And quite frankly, the African Americans that did serve in the war, they served in segregated units. They were not alongside white American soldiers, and often they were under the command of Allied military leaders. I mentioned the Harlem Hellfighters worked alongside the French and sort of took direction from French military officers. And after the war was over, they received significant military honor from the French military for their heroism and their sacrifice in the war, but they weren't working alongside Americans. However, these Black service members working alongside European military leaders who were white, they were treated as equals. They were treated with respect, and they came back to America hopeful that their white Americans would feel the same way and welcome them with open arms and treat them with respect. That didn't happen. Black men that were out in public in military uniform when they arrived home were often subject to racial taunts and even racial violence. White Americans simply did not accept Black Americans as equal citizens socially or politically. They were content for Jim Crow segregation to remain the place, and the rigid hierarchy socially and politically that was part and parcel with Jim Crow America to sort of remain in place after World War I, whereas these Black military veterans wanted something more. They wanted equality, and that created tension between the races. Another factor that contributed to the racial violence during this time period involves a major population and demographic shift. I had talked earlier in this semester about the Jim Crow laws that were implemented in the South during the 1890s and the 1900s, the widespread lynchings that took place in the South during that time, stripping Black men of the franchise and the ability to vote, as well as the construction and implementation of construction and erection, I should say, of Confederate monuments and memorializing Confederate soldiers. All of that was taking place across the South in the 1890s and the 1900s. So what happened was, in the 1910s, quite a few Black Southerners began to leave the South and move to the industrial Northeast and the Midwest. Some of them moved to the West Coast, but most of them moved into the industrial Northeast and Midwest. They wanted a chance to earn higher wages and not be under the thumb of white Southerners who were strictly enforcing racial segregation in the South by force if necessary. So the Great Migration begins in the 1910s, and it continues throughout the first half of the 20th century, all the way up until roughly World War II or the end of World War II, late 1940s, early 1950s, and millions of Black Americans moved out of the South, and many of them settled in large cities, urban areas in the industrial Northeast and Midwest. Chicago seemed to be arguably the most popular destination of them all, and quite a few of these African Americans moved into Chicago and the Chicago region during the early years of the Great Migration, and they kept coming decade after decade that followed. So what happens is, by the end of the 1910s, when you're 1918, 1919, all of a sudden, Chicago's Black population has exploded in number, and that led to more and more situations where Black Chicagoans were living adjacent to white neighborhoods, or the neighborhoods of white Chicagoans. There was competition for jobs in factories, in meat packing plants, in all kinds of sort of working class jobs that required manual labor, hard days work, but pretty decent pay, particularly if for folks that did not possess a college degree or even a high school diploma. Those jobs prior to the Great Migration had gone exclusively to white residents of cities like Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Pittsburgh and other places like that. Now all of a sudden there was direct competition for those same jobs from this wave after wave of African Americans, particularly African American men. And so in the views of white residents of these large urban areas and cities, the influx of African American residents meant that these people were coming after their jobs, and there was a fear that there was only so many jobs to go around, and they didn't want to be the ones, the white residents of these cities didn't want to be the ones left out without a job or without a good paying job or a secure employment during this time. So, the fact that there was competition for jobs and money as a result of the Great Migration, and also neighborhoods that had previously been spatially segregated. I mean, these neighborhoods were still generally segregated, all white, all black neighborhoods, but usually there had been some sort of buffer or some sort of distance between the neighborhoods. But now the sheer volume of African Americans that came into the region during this time meant that they were moving into buildings and homes that were brushing up right up against the white neighborhoods, which meant that there was going to be interaction between the communities, and the slightest little thing might spark a tremendous conflagration of violence at that time, such as what we saw in 1919 on the Lake Michigan beach area, where one young black teen's raft just innocently drifts into the white section of the beach, the white section of the waters, and all of a sudden, all heck breaks loose. And it's just something that was very unfortunate and inexcusable, frankly, but it was something that occurred. And we still kind of see that a little bit today with the idea of folks from different races living right up against each other in residential areas. And what I mean by that is, the interacting with folks when there's only so many jobs to go around and only so much prosperity, that's still an underlying fear among certain communities in certain parts of America today. That's still very much a problem that America has yet to overcome. Building off of that Great Migration and the fear of jobs, I mentioned Greenwood in Tulsa, known as Black Wall Street, because of all the successful black-owned businesses. In certain cities and in certain regions of the country, blacks did own businesses, and many of those businesses were quite successful. So there was a level of success and economic prosperity within certain black communities that, frankly, had not been prevalent in America to this point. In the 19th century, much of the black population in America was enslaved up through the Civil War, and then we had sharecroppers and tenant farmers in the South in the decades after the Civil War. But now we're starting to see some real economic prosperity amongst certain black communities. And again, call it jealousy, call it whatever you want. The white folks of that time period were unsettled by this. They didn't like it. They thought that that this would cause irreparable damage to the established social hierarchy and political hierarchy because of newfound money and wealth within the black community. And that was something that struck a lot of fear into white communities across the country, not just in the South, also in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and even on the West Coast. And this is something that will continue throughout the 20th century. We'll see this as a recurring problem all over the country throughout the 20th century. Also, the final reason that I want to leave you with regarding the factors that led to racial violence during this time, in the middle of this decade, in 1915, there were two events that really resulted in a tremendous surge of white supremacy around the country. In 1915, the movie The Birth of a Nation was released. This was the very early days of movies, or motion pictures as they called them back then. And this was really kind of the first national blockbuster movie in terms of popularity. And it lionized the Confederate Army and the Ku Klux Klan. And as a result, a bunch of white Americans that saw that movie really took the message to heart from the film. And not long after the film came out, William J. Simmons organizes a group in Stone Mountain, Georgia, in the fall of 1915. As he basically relaunches the Ku Klux Klan. And we talked about the Klan earlier this semester as it originated amongst Confederate veterans in the early years following following the Civil War in the 1860s. It had been dormant for decades prior to Birth of a Nation, but following the release of Birth of the Nation, William J. Simmons organizes a new Ku Klux Klan in Stone Mountain, Georgia in 1915, and it takes off. It spreads throughout the country. It spreads to cities, as opposed to the first version of the Klan that was largely rural communities and rural Americans. This second incarnation of the Klan, which begins in 1915 and really peaks in the middle of the 1920s, has active chapters in cities like Detroit and a lot of other large urban areas across the country. At its peak, there were 4 million Americans that claimed a membership in the second incarnation of the KKK. And this group feared anybody that wasn't a white American of Anglo-Saxon origin, ancestry, because they feared not only blacks moving from the South into the Northeast and the Midwest, but also at this point, America had had several decades of immigration, primarily from Eastern and Western Europe, but especially Catholic immigrants coming in from places like Italy and Poland and Germany and other areas of that portion of Europe. And white Americans of Anglo-Saxon ancestry did not consider these new immigrants to be white, to be true white people, and they feared Catholicism as a religion because it differed significantly from the principles of Protestant Christianity in America during this time period. Jewish folks were also feared and terrorized by members of the KKK during this time. It's essentially the idea of a changing America in which the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant families, whose families had been in power for generations of America, dating back to the early settlers of America in the 17th century, the 1600s, they felt like all of these demographic changes were going to result in job loss, the loss of income and wealth, social and cultural changes that would irreparably alter their communities, and it was an environment of fear all the way around. So those are the reasons, the chief reasons for racial violence, and a lot of it comes down to fear of cultural difference, fear of racial difference, and fear of social, political, economic status, jobs, money, political influence and power. These are the things that are the impetus for the racial violence that we see break out in Red Summer in 1919, in the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, and it will continue throughout the 1920s and continue to crop up really throughout the rest of the 20th century from time to time. So that will conclude our first lecture for this week. I'll leave it there, and we'll discuss more of the societal and cultural changes that took place in America in the 1920s on Thursday.